Brought to you by Telehelping, a virtual assistant staffing company for professionals.
Hello, everyone. My name is Cody Hall. I'm the hostess. That's funny, right? Host of The Faces, Entrepreneurs Are People Too, and the founding CEO of Telehelping, a virtual staffing organization, and the herein sponsor of my podcast. So I really, truly appreciate Telehelping for allowing me the opportunity to speak to wonderful people like Drago. How are you doing today, Drago?
Great, Cody. Yeah, thanks for having me. I know you're in the throes of fatherhood round 2, right, with the newborn.
Correct. And even more so, I'm actually down in Mexico this week trying to get everything with our home here situated so that my family, now that the new child has entered this world, can go back to living in Mexico full time.
Okay, so
Yeah, we'll get
that's your
there.
full
We'll
time
get
life.
there.
Yeah, plot
But you know
twist.
what? I don't want to talk too much about me. We will a little bit, but I want a little bit about you first. So before we jump into that, we'll touch there. Tell the listeners today, because they know me at this point.
Yeah,
Some
fair
people
enough.
say
Yeah.
some people say they know my personality, which I think is really cool, which we'll touch on later as well. And but tell us, who are we chatting with here today? Who's Drago, which is such a great name, by the way. So incredibly unique. It's a
Thank you.
memorable one.
Yeah. I must be like some secret Russian spy, or something like that.
Possibly. We'll get there.
We'll figure it out. No. So Drago was born in Bulgaria. I grew up in the Midwest in Indiana, so small town kind of exposure. And right, yeah, in a world of like Tom, Bill, John, and then here's this Drago. So went to small school, 14 kid graduating class. I mean, so
Wow.
really small, which I credit is developing the fundamentals and like the kind of earthiness of life, some of the more relational qualitative appreciation, as opposed to kind of the more ambitious driven calculation mentality that then as an adult going to New York City for the first 5 years of my career, Chicago, et cetera, so it's kind of like a compliment there. I like to pay homage to that experience growing up. But yeah, I went to University of Notre Dame, did my first part of career in finance, investing, hedge funds, buy-side investing, got my MBA at Chicago Booth, pivoted to, venture capital, technology, startups, was kind of like dabbling my feet in a couple of different directions. And then a couple of years ago, in line with my upbringing, because there was also a religious component to that as well, and values, I became CEO of Holy Habits, which is an app designed for Catholics who want to become saints. So if it's like, hey, I want to become from Drago to Saint Drago, what's the actual roadmap to get there? What do I need to do? And we leverage AI and the church teachings and things like that.
That's really incredible. Um, I myself, not being Catholic, right?
Sure.
In light of most recent events with the Pope, my wife and I watched a Pope-based movie that kind of walked us through. I don't remember the name of it.
But you probably watched Conclave, right?
Conclave.
I'm
All
assuming
right.
that's trending. Okay,
Yeah, it is trending. You are correct, and it did win an Oscar. That's why we picked it as well.
Yeah.
Not for all things involved in it, like the drama that is stirred up from it being a movie, right?
Yeah.
But it's just the process I took from what goes into selecting a pope, right?
Yeah.
Like what
Right.
was that process? And I didn't know it was so. And it could be accurate, it could be inaccurate, right? I'm referencing a movie here. Maybe you'll be able to speak to that a bit more. But I didn't know it was so almost like a republic. Like there's this Congress, a body of cardinals who are coming together and voting. I didn't know it was a voting process. I didn't know there was a line. So that was an interesting perspective for me to take.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like, the US presidential election where every 4 years we get a refresh. With the Pope, it could be decades, so it's not something people think about because it just doesn't happen as often as other things. But yeah, for sure, it's there's an election process, and it's supposed to be secret, right? Secret ballots, so you're not really supposed to know who's voting for what. I mean, people might talk about it, but yeah, and then everyone waits for the white smoke. Everyone outside of the building waits for the white smoke signal, which means the Pope has been selected. But yeah. So it's
No,
interesting
I like
procedure.
that. And it's interesting as well because, I'm correlating what you told me about the school size and your religious upbringing.
Yeah.
One of my dear friends, Obadiah, right? There's
Yeah.
a biblical name.
Yeah.
He, very similar situation. He was in a school of 13, right? He used to be a ex-military buddy of mine, volleyball partner. We used to play beach volleyball together,
Nice.
and very very similar perspective. Very
Yeah.
tiny school, and so it was I learned a lot from him. Like what was it, going to you really know who you go to school with,
Oh
like
man, yeah, right. Oh, everyone knows everything about you and you about them, and right, yeah, there's no like walking by someone and kind of maintaining gaze. Like you have to acknowledge, and right, it's a whole different.
I like it a lot more intimate. And so it was a Midwest, right? And so
Yeah.
wait, I think he was in the Northeast, New York, but
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Right.
yeah, but that's an interesting perspective. I couldn't imagine. I think my high school class was 500, 600 people,
Yeah.
right? You could put them in a lineup and I wouldn't pick 12 of them correctly. Promise.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was a big shift for me. I mean, University of Notre Dame, they're not a huge university. I think like 10,000 students total. So even then,
Total.
small.
Oh,
But that was a big shift for me when I was yeah, I went from like, oh, captain of these sports teams and homecoming king at this small little school, right? Like, well,
yeah, yeah.
and then like you're surrounded by everyone who's like captain of this, captain of that, whatever. So that was like an interesting from big fish, little pond, if I could say, to then like opens up the world. And then you have to like figure out that hierarchy or, orientation. And then you get to New York City where, geez, you're just like in the
Yeah.
wallpaper, you're plugging in the matrix and, it's like, right. So
Just
it's,
another
yeah, that's
human
the,
in New York City. So you
yep.
went from tiny little high school to moderate sized university, which, 10,000 total. My university, I think, was just around 31,000, right?
Okay. Yeah.
University of North Carolina. Right.
Yeah.
So it's like, huge school. Right.
Right. Right.
But that's I'm used to being a number though, I guess, go to a big school, go to a big college and then go to the Marine Corps where they even
Yeah.
dress you the same. Right. Blending in has been my
Yeah.
forte. I like saying the gray man for the most part.
The gray man. Yeah.
The gray man. Well, that's interesting. So talk to me about your transition from, you know, this, what I would say, capitalism, right?
Yeah. Right.
And
Sure.
in my perspective, I don't know if you can find much God in the works of money, right?
Right. Oh,
I
yeah.
say that as someone who deals in equities, right?
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
who's been in the startup game for a long time. And I've not seen a whole lot of, holiness going on over there. And
Right.
then now you're into, a company that's, helps you become a saint, right? So how did that take place?
Yeah, there's two threads we could take this. One of them is kind of the bigger picture of right, the state of capitalism and kind of where we're headed now, where that system itself seems to be reaching potentially its limits due to a variety of changes in technology, culture, and even tracing it back to the Enlightenment period, right, where a certain way of thinking and approaching the world through calculation, through utility maximization, pros and cons, this kind of private individualistic orientation compared to a more integrated kind of social way of connecting with reality. So that's one thread. But then the other thread, yeah, personally for me, without even having those thoughts developed, it was just noticing that. Well, let me phrase it this way first. Like as an investor, as you know, there's the spectrum of like early stage, like helping fund and build companies. And so when you supply capital, that capital is fueling innovation. It's like solving problems. So like the dollar bill is solving some problems. But then the more you advance in like later stage companies and then secondary trades where it's just, like right now, if we buy and sell Apple stock or Tesla, our capital isn't really per se, funding innovation.
Correct.
It's just, numbers and playing a secondary game. And so, as an investor, we did some primary investing, but then there's also secondaries. And when it comes to secondaries, there's a big existential rationalization, or at least that any thoughtful person in the field would think is like, well, what am I actually contributing to society?
Yeah.
And if you're on the secondary trading where you're just trying to maximize returns on a portfolio, make the numbers go up and, diversify and all that, you kind of have to do this butterfly effect rationalization where it's like, oh, when I buy and sell securities, my market activity in combination with all of the other market participants is stabilizing prices and it's stabilizing interest rates so that the mom and pop person who's trying to take out a loan in the bank has some stability and then they can predict their future and family planning. Or, we have the pension fund or the
Interesting.
retirement money that we're managing. And so by increasing the size of that fund, people will have a better retirement. So you kind of like a couple of degrees of rationalizations as far as like why what you're doing is meaningful. When at the end of the day, like in a day-to-day level, you're just trying to make the number go up. It's playing the game, and there's an intellectual stimulation that's really fun and competent, and that has its own appeal. But for me, I wanted to um, have the more tangible impact of building something where I can see the fruits of my labor. Because the second dimension to that, and just to cap that off, is the inability to differentiate skill from luck. Now, yes, there's constant research and academia and alpha and how do we attribute true performance to investing. But I will tell you, and I'm happy to justify this point by point, but there is no way to separate skill from luck in the ultimate analysis. The people who've been in the field 20 years, 30 years, they're just better storytellers, and they can tell a story to investors about why the investor worked out because we had amazing foresight, or the investment failed because, the market conditions changed, and that's affecting everybody. And, so that was my
No,
shift.
Drago, that is a well put on two perspectives I want to revisit in regards to my thought processes. One, you're absolutely right. Our involvement with the market is something that it is a participating for ultimate stabilization, right? Like you said. And that was something that I was bringing forward to a friend of mine who was very anti-Tesla all of a sudden with all the recent news that went on, right?
Mhm.
And they're all trying to drive the stock down, drive the stock down, drive the stock down. They want it to go to zero, some people. And I said, okay, let's talk about this for a moment, right? You're wanting to drive stock down because of a man, right? I'm like, but do you know how many portfolios, pensions, and organizations have Tesla
Yeah.
in their holdings? Now we're
Right.
talking about people's 401ks here. You aren't hurting Elon Musk, right?
That's right.
You'd be a fool to think that he went into this not understanding that he could lose billions,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so, however, I personally know people who were having almost heart attacks when Tesla went from 350 to 250. Like they're like sweating because so many of their so much of the 401k was this rocket ship of Tesla they were holding, and they were freaking out, right? And so who are we hurting here is the question, right?
Yes.
I never, I am a bear at heart, right? And so I have to counteract my bareness with actual like thought processes and check marks as to why I'm making decisions. But it also leads into my second part here. I don't know what's going to happen any more than the next person next to me, right? Just because you have a win rate, right, doesn't mean you are going to predict something. Like, my wife is a great example, right? Zero understanding of the market except for what she sees on TikTok, right? And I'm a technical trader, right? So
Yeah.
I look at things from the degree of supply and demand. I use things like Fibonacci, and I use, of course, price trends and all. And I'm probably a good trade's 3 reasons for me. A great trade's 5, right? And even then they go wrong, right? They go wrong because no more or less than anyone else. And as soon as you make a decision, I always say that I could be very confident. I'm like, oh, it's a good trade, or I'm happy with that decision. And it could go sideways because of a tweet, because of a trade deal, because of, as my uncle would so sagely put in all his business wisdom, right? He's like, a sheik could fart in the Middle East, right? And gas prices could plummet. And for that reason, everything goes through the roof, right? And so, you are correct. There is both ability to see the workings of good in the market,
Yes.
and there's also likewise the hand in hand, which I would see almost as like a perfect beta, right? They have a correct relationship with each other. You also see the unpredictability and just the general faith you have to have in things as you're participating in them. So knowledge is important, but faith and awareness is also a part of it as well. So I agree. Answer our own question. We did full circle together.
Full circle. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And yeah, the Tesla thought, yeah, I do find that humorous and strange for sure. How people will, well, not to get preachy, but I think it's important, regardless of which perspective you come, as far as worldviews and what drives you and your values. I'm a firm believer that you need to have a clear understanding of the hierarchy of values that drive your decision making. And, you know, and so you understand, like, so if there's a conflict where you're in a difficult moral situation, you can understand which principle overrides the other principle.
Yep.
So to your point, right? Let's say with the Tesla thing, like you're saying, there's this principle of like there's people like actual livelihoods being affected. Then this other principle of like making a political statement because you want to see a specific man suffer because you think he's done some bad things. And it's like, to
Correct.
me, are people even evaluating the tension of principles in their when they're making these decisions, or are they just kind of like rashly acting whatever the impulse is, whatever's being shown on the screen? It's
Yeah.
you know what I mean. So yeah, I think that the
You know,
hierarchy of value is important.
I agree in much of that statement. I'll even expand on my thought process because regardless of political opinions of anybody, right? And I can say most of my life as a voter, the person I vote for never won, right? And in spite of that, never did I wake up wanting the democracy of the United States to fail, right? I
Yeah,
never, but I've had conversations with people like, oh, you know what? The United States just needs to crumble, not become a superpower, all that stuff. And then I listen to what they're saying. And I'm like, do you understand what that would mean for the world? Right.
right.
You have to talk about like if we look at things from a utilitarian perspective, right? The
Yep.
greater good of the world, right? Is the United States perfect? Absolutely not. So
Sure.
I could
Right.
poke holes in it all day long. But when we look at the greater existence of humans, right? And we want to talk about humans in our history as a whole, it wasn't less than 100 years ago where 3,500 people were dying a day in a war, right? We've not seen that type of attrition of human life and single events in almost 100 years, right? And
Yeah.
we have to ask ourselves, like, is that good? We have to ask ourselves the impact of, the ability of foreign aid, which is, something that helps countries like, the greater African countries, Asian countries with their protection. So a lot of things that the United States offer, while not perfect, I never sat there. Joe Biden's not my favorite person, but I never sat there and said, man, I really hope this guy fails. No, he represents the United States. I need him to succeed. I need him to
Yeah.
succeed.
Well, that, yeah, though that's, yeah, it's interesting because like, right. So on the one hand, right, there's this weird um, self-sabotaging mindset that it's easy to criticize and tear something down to build something up, right? And so
I agree.
especially a lot of the generations coming out of the university in the last 20, 30 years, there's such an emphasis on like critiquing the foundations and challenging the status quo and kind of overthrowing tradition and all this stuff. But where it's such a disruption in the order that you're just throwing chaos and chaos, like, you know, to create, as long as you have a clear idea of how you're going to reorganize the chaos, like, okay, but just to make things chaotic just because you don't like the existing order, um, that there's some problems there for sure. So I agree that it's easy to say this is the problem, but to propose a solution is an altogether different matter. At the same time, I suppose one would have to take a view on like what's inevitable versus what's solvable. So let's say on the one hand, if you think that there is a path where you can band-aid the pieces together and like we'll get through the difficult time and then now we're back to like glory days, and that's a path. Whereas other people say, it's like the leaky ship and you can patch it, but it's eventually going to leak and sink. And so do you accelerate the sink so that you can just start with a new vessel? And I suppose in all political movements and revolutions and all this stuff, that's always the tension is, can you reform the existing system or do you just let the system die and have a new system take over? And I think that's always been the historical tension.
No, and I think that tying that to the entrepreneurs right here as well, right? Even getting away from like government and politics, church and religion, right?
Yeah.
Very separate. People always say, "Oh, the church." I'm like, "Well, the church is an establishment that is based around a religion, right? In itself." A government that's based around an ideal, right? Freedom, democracy, United States, things like that. So
Right.
same
Right.
thing with the perspective that we take as leaders, right? I understand that the decisions I make have a domino effect, right? And so if it's about my own team, right? If I'm wanting to replace a person, would be an interesting perspective. Like you have to ask yourself, well, change cost, right? I gotta get someone, back. It's easier to take them from there's a book. What's it called? How to Make a Few Billion. It talks about A and B players, C players, and D players.
Okay.
Can you take a C to a B? Can you take a B to an A? Right? You can never make a C an A, and you can never make a D a B, right? You have to ask yourself those questions and where they are, and then that's how you decide whether you're going to invest in somebody or if it's a better choice to swap out. And so, you think about that. You think about, well, what if you're changing out someone who deals with clients, right? Okay, so I'm changing out. No, so now I'm changing a client-facing person who represents 50 clients, who also, in telehelping's perspective, also manages 50 virtual assistants, because we do a unified management. So the same person who manages the virtual assistant also manages the client relationship. It keeps
Mm,
things simple, right?
yeah.
And
Right. I
so
see.
now you have 100 elements impacted, right, by
Yeah.
changing one person, right? And so it can cascade. So you have to ask, like, all right, well, how is this going to impact the businesses I support? How's it going to impact the families that all those virtual assistants? I like to not count revenue. I like to count lives supported. So I think about how many families I support, how many kids that those adults represent, right? And and the fact that they like eating, right? So when I make decisions in regards to careers and jobs, right, we just wave our wands sometimes as leaders and make decisions. But are we thinking like, oh well, you know Juan has 4 kids, right? That he is the sole producer for. So is what I'm replacing him for really worth uprooting his life? Sometimes it is. Sometimes you have to make those decisions, but
Yeah.
also it helps you balance out those impacts. And I think about that in every decision, sometimes quicker than others, right?
Yeah.
But you have to think about that as entrepreneurs of our own world.
Yeah. That's really a profound thing to focus on. And it kind of, I know when we start talking about capitalism, I mean, that's the layer that, of virtue, right? I mean, that you can't just be a numbers maximizing guy without virtue. Otherwise society falls apart. So what you're talking
Yeah,
about is a layer of virtue where, yeah, I mean, if Juan has the family of 4, well, as far as your company, your shareholder return, that's not a factor that gets into the
correct.
equation if that's all you're thinking about. But when you apply the virtue layer in kind of, yeah, justice and these other things, yeah, how uh, you have a relationship with these people. These are not just like cogs in your machine, but these are people that you also have a relationship and you've built a community with. And so there's other factors. And sometimes it's tough, right? I mean, at the same time, we have a mission. We need to grow the company, so
Correct.
we can't
We have
completely sacrifice
responsibilities,
that.
fiduciary responsibilities to
Fiduciary,
shareholders. Yeah.
right? People are investing in you. You have a relationship with them. Your investors, for sure. So, yeah, it's very true what you're saying. Um, the other thing, man, what you're talking about. So yeah, in like the business schools, right? They have the, what was the name of the author? The Christensen, is it Clay Christensen or something? Um,
I think he's quick because yeah,
Christian,
you're
yeah, there's
right.
some guy on management, and it did stick with me. He said management is the most noble profession. I'm like, oh, really? Like being a manager? And he's like, well, there's no other role that has a greater influence on someone's life than the boss, because the employee spends most of their day with you. They spend more time with you than they do their family, depending on the employee. Um, Whether they have a good or bad day, like, you have the greatest influence, right? You have a bad day at work and then that affects their mood at home. You have a great work experience. They have a good time at home. And so, um, that thought gave me some, assurance when I wasn't sure what kind of industry or what to work on. And like, what if I'm not attracted to this industry? Well, hey, like, if I'm going to be a manager, regardless of what industry I'm in, that's a real like vocation of like helping people. Even if our business is doing some widget, we're just doing some widget thing, but the people that I'm interacting with, I can really have a positive impact on. So
No, I definitely enjoy that. I think that there has been definitely a period of my life as an entrepreneur where I was there. The virtue may have been low,
yeah,
right?
sure.
And so you're just like, listen, we have an objective to reach, right? And it's a lofty one. And so you either are getting the job done or you're getting replaced, right? And
Right.
it's the thought process I had to have. I always have a rule. I first rule is you have to do your job well,
Yeah.
right? That's my rule with all my staff. If you do your job well, I can like you, right?
Yeah.
Right. And it's I love liking my staff. It's
Yeah.
so easy to like your staff, right?
Yeah.
Like if you
Yeah.
have good people, you hire great people, I want to like them. But it's all predicated on number one, right? I
Yeah.
can't like you if you don't do your job, right?
Right.
so
Yeah.
and
That's
so
right.
I always go back to that, and I have to oftentimes be the person who balances virtue for the company because our client and staff member managers, right? They care about
Mhm.
their people, right? And so they said, no, Cody's great. I want to be able to, he's such a great, it's not working out with this client for X, Y, and reason. And they're like, yeah, well, let's peel back some layers. Maybe I oftentimes always jump into the communication piece of things when there's conflict, right? And we're like,
Yeah.
well, why isn't it working out? We try to peel it back and understand. Sometimes the greatest person in the world isn't a good fit, right? We can think the world of them and they're not a good fit, right? And that happens
Yeah.
on rare
That's
occasions.
right.
But I
Yeah.
have to jump into those conversations, be like, hey, listen, I like Cody too. However, right, Cody isn't meshing well with the direction Drago wants to go, right?
Right.
And for
Sure.
that reason, we can be the best person in the world to us if they don't work out. And so
Yeah.
I always take that perspective as well.
Yeah, I mean, for sure, because right, some difficulties can be resolved. Other difficulties are just fundamentally the square peg doesn't fit in the round hole, and so it's even best for both parties for long term peace of mind. It's just going to be
Of
better to
course.
split. Yeah, yeah,
One thing that I will say as I was talking that I wanted to mention that people who are listening, we're going to start working in a special edition to our podcast once a week where, right now we're entrepreneurs are people. We're actually going to start doing virtual assistants are people
oh,
too
cool.
once a week. And it spurred from the idea that I was having this conversation with a client, and it was sometimes our clients can forget, if we don't do our job well, that virtual assistants are humans, right? They eat, breathe, live, they pay rent, pay mortgage, they have kids, right? And so we oftentimes just label them the stamp virtual assistant, and it's this broad uh, non-human label. And
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
which is why I actually don't like the phrase virtual assistant. I call them, remote staff or remote employees, just because it humanizes it a little bit more.
Yeah, what is just the ISP just randomly cut off the valve for you for a couple minutes?
Correct. It just cut off everything. That's
Mhm.
half the process of trying to get back before my family to get everything smoothed out for us.
Yeah,
So well, what I'll do is I want to be respectful of your time. I know we don't have a whole lot more time, so I'll just pick up for where I left off, and then
sure.
we'll just continue on, and I'll have them edit this out.
Yeah, right on. Yeah, with the VAs and the remote staff,
Yeah,
humanity. Yeah, yep.
of course. So wonderful. Yeah, I was I had the conversation with my staff about it. I was like, I think this would be really great because we just keep having interactions sometimes with clients where they treat them less than human occasionally. And we don't stick up for it. To like we'll have a conversation with a client and say, hey, listen, real human here. Right? Most of the times that works. But I think that it would be great to kind of tear down some of the barriers, distance between the remote element. Calling a virtual assistant makes them feel less than human. So we're gonna run a little beta test to see if we can have one episode a week with a virtual assistant,
I love that.
uh, and then we'll see how it goes. See if it's popular.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. I mean, to connect it with, at least from the Catholic perspective, there's a big emphasis on like the intrinsic dignity of every person. And so there's this moral principle where a human being should never be treated as a means to an end, but should always be the end itself. So yeah, especially, I mean, it's tough, right? But especially in business, it's easy if we're not paying attention to start treating people as like tools to facilitate an outcome as opposed to like, humans, right? And so it is always it's a good thing to keep top of mind. So yeah, your initiative with the episodes, I think, sounds like a valuable contribution in that regard. Yeah.
It is well, and I think that maybe that particular approach, would that be a holy habit for somebody? Would
That's the holy, yeah, the holy habit. Yeah, our app, because our app generates habits. If someone put that, how do I make sure I treat my staff, with the full dignity of humans? Yeah, see what our app would suggest. Maybe our app would say, right, like each day contemplate and think about your staff, and yeah, think about their life experience of that they're imagine how they go home to their families, imagine that they have hopes and dreams and fears, right? And so yeah, for sure.
I love that. I love it. And so let's talk about holy habits, right?
Yeah.
Let's dive into that. We've had a lot of philosophical, right,
Yeah.
conversation, but why did you end up landing on holy habits as the venture you wanted to go with? And then, talk about kind of how it all works.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So as far as why, so there's the personal level, and then like what's just happening in society, and that there's a really important problem to solve. On the personal level, I mean, yeah, given my background, I've always been connected and integrated in the faith, the Christian faith. And I always wanted, in prayer, is there a way to align my professional skills? Because I did pick up what wasn't taken. I have a certain set of skills, or whatever he said. Uh, I did have some skills, but then I wanted to also deploy them
I
in a
love it.
way that advances kind of this broader, let's say promotion of love, like truth, goodness, and beauty, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. So there's that personal driver. And then as far as the place, we're at a place in society where I think people are re-embracing challenge. We're re-embracing challenge. Like we went through a phase where everything was comfort, comfort, comfort. But now people, it turned into this nihilistic, people don't have meaning. What's the point? And so now you see a resurgence of like the hero's journey. Like I want the challenge and I want to come out on top. There's the loneliness problem, disconnection, right? So even from a secular perspective, there's already the breeding ground for this. And you see it in the surge of like the personal wellness coaching industry, optimization of nutrition, like what are my calorie steps, what are my macros, my heart glucose, sleep cycles, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And so there's an obsession on that dimension, but there's a real need for the spiritual life and virtue and a lot of these principles that have been so valuable, but haven't had the attention, at least in the last 50 years. So anyway, there's a moment in time. I think there's a greater like zeitgeist. So that's plugging in, and then specifically within Catholics, if you read the writings of the saints and the church, they call there's the paradigm of ascent. So from Drago to Saint Drago, it's kind of like three stages to become fully unified with God. Because from the Christian perspective, you're going from where you're at to like the end state is a full like partaker of divinity. You're completely just united and infused with Christ, right, and love, right? So you're just complete love, all that. So anyway, the first stage, though, 95% of Catholics are stuck on the first stage, which is this wrestle against as we would say the flesh, or sins, habitual sins, and vices. In the framework, I know I mean, this has been pretty
No.
philosophical, so
Yeah, yeah, of
why change
course.
too much? So in the framework that's called the triple concupiscence. So humanity, they struggle with three things. Every person, we all struggle with these three things. Uh, One way is the pride of life, the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh. Another way to say it, it's pride, vanity, sensuality. And to break that down further, we have the disordered attachment to excellence, pride. We have the disordered attachment to attention or reputation, how we're perceived, so where we care about what people think. And we have a disordered attachment to sense pleasures, comforts, things like that. And so we each have those three elements that we're kind of doing war with, right? That's the real fight, is how do you master those three things? And one of those three things for each of one of us is going to be more dominant than the other. And it's going to color our interactions with other people. It's going to color the way we approach work. It's going to color all these things. So anyway, how it works is when you sign up, and even if you're not a Catholic, if you just like understanding yourself better, you could still kind of
Yeah.
find this valuable. One of the first things you do after signing up is called the root sin assessment. So it's figuring out these three things, and once you figure out that, we collect some context. We ask, like, describe your life situation. I'm an entrepreneur. I have a family of so and so. this is what I'm worried about. This is what I'm excited. So you put whatever context you want, and then our app will generate some habits, some programs, some things to focus on. And then what it'll do is it'll text you every day. So not just like push notification, but you get a text message like, hey, Cody, here's your 3 habits, your 5 habits, the goals you're trying to do. And you can log via text. So you just text back 1, 2, 3,
That's
bam,
cool.
it tracks it. And so that's kind of like the flagship entry. Now we do a lot more than that. It's an overall platform for, as we say, sanctification. But our flagship offering was this kind of habit generation engine. And so yeah, that's been a pretty fun ride with that.
That's interesting. It's almost like a technology version of a guardian angel, like a guiding angel almost in a sense. You're
Yes.
able to get like feedback and thought process. Like, oh, hey,
Yes.
I'm falling short on this particular sin or on this particular habit, and then it can give you direction as to, how to
So
walk around that mishap or
yeah,
that's pretty cool. And it
yes.
texts you. So it's a little bit more like a human's having a conversation with you.
Well, completely. I love that you use the word direction. So because there's another motivating principle, and since you brought that up, so in the Catholic faith, there's a concept called spiritual direction, and this is an ancient practice where for people who are serious about, hey man, I want to do this, I want to become virtuous, and participate in love and all this stuff. You have a mentor, a spiritual director you're accountable towards. And 100 years ago, I mean, 90% of people had a spiritual director. Now it's like 5%. It's gone down. There's a big supply and demand gap. And so one of the precursors to Holy Habits is we have this other platform that does matchmaking. It's an algorithm between people and spiritual directors. And so Holy Habits, though, is a tool using technology to offer spiritual direction at scale. So yes, that's exactly what's happened. It's not meant to replace a spiritual director, but for people who can't get access to one, or who aren't ready for that, we do offer a spiritual direction. So that's exactly what the vision is and what we do.
What I like about this, and I think that's applicable to a lot of the folks who subscribe to our podcast, is that as entrepreneurs, you can sometimes be siloed and be very alone. It is lonely at the top of your own mountain, right?
Yes,
And so
yes,
there's not a lot of input, direction. And if you do, I mean, if your company's big enough, you have investors or you have advisors, strategic advisors, like I have investors and strategic advisors that I
yeah,
can pull on. However, you know, how much do you want to bother them with all your inner thoughts all the time, right?
sure, right.
Saying that I want to erode the confidence of my
That's
investors by sharing with them some of my more intimate
It's a real
thought process or
conflict, right,
challenges.
right, because
Yeah.
right, yeah, you feel like you have to portray and they're counting on you because they're investing, calculating a risk premium. Well, if Cody is now sharing these thoughts, maybe the risk premium's gone up and I need to, give you whatever, right?
I don't know if I want this guy being the fiduciary in charge of my investment. So,
Yeah,
yeah, no, that's really great, and I think that's what a cool journey, and what an interesting man you are to be
thank
on
you.
this journey from your background, and also your definitely more ability to step outside and kind of view challenges and perspectives. I think is a unique thing that I don't get a lot of opportunity to speak to people.
Mm,
Much like myself, oftentimes I tell people, or at least I feel inside myself, I'm standing outside of my own conversations sometimes, or my
mm,
own perspectives and life events, and I'm
yeah,
watching them unfold from a different person. And so I
mhm,
like to do that. And I feel like you can do that as well. Kind of, I know there's a particular word for it, but I don't really live through my own vessel most of the time. I'm always looking through my own eyes. I'm
mm.
taking it from another angle most of the time. I feel like you also have that ability, which is why you've built the company you have and its purpose. I think that's really unique to meet someone of similar approach.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah, it's valuable. Yeah, I get the sense you can tell when people are thoughtful. And what I know I'm just kind of dropping different ideas here, but to me, what was kind of related to this idea is the notion of the cardinal virtue, the ultimate virtue of prudence. And so prudence is being aware of the general principles, and then here you are in your specific situation, and it's thoughtfully, how do I apply the principle to my situation so I can answer what is the right thing to do? And so a lot of times we don't even, sometimes people don't even ask that question, right? So step one is ask the question, what is the right thing to do? If I don't ask that, I'm just throwing myself into life situations. I'm just kind of being rash, right? And then being thoughtful about evaluating things, stepping outside and seeing the situation holistically, I think is really important. So yeah, I do appreciate that you also appreciate that. Yeah.
No, I think it's great. And I think this is going to be a wonderful podcast for people to listen to who are, growing teams, getting impact. If I had to throw an overarching thought process here, a lot of this is very applicable to decision making, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I would have never labeled myself such a virtuous person. So, and now I have, I'm thinking, like, well, maybe I am more
Yeah.
so
Hey,
than I
man, it's
thought.
a scale,
And so,
you know?
right?
Yeah,
No, and
absolutely.
well, sir, I thank you for your time. I think that for those who want to reach out to you, we're going to be having all this hyperlinked here. So if you want to reach out to Drago, learn more about the holy habits, and it'd be great to even be able to download the app. It's an application. I'm taking
Yeah,
it, so it's
iOS and
available on.
Android, so on your smartphone. Yep.
Perfect. Look at that. He didn't even pick one. He gave you both, right? For even for the Android people out there and the iPhone users. So, sir, thank you so much for your time. I know we had some technical mishaps, but it all came together well, I think.
It did. Thank you, sir. Appreciate your time, Cody.
Well,
Great time.
be well.
This video was brought to you by our official sponsor, Telehelping. Need support for your business? Telehelping connects you with top-tier remote staff to help you streamline operations and fuel growth. Go to telehelping.com and get started today.